She sent one message to a shadow from her past. He answered with a promise that would rewrite her future. Tonight you'll witness how a woman's shattered world and a single-digit error pulled her into the shadow of a man who commands the silence of the city. Kai Min-Jun. The kind of absolute authority that doesn't need to shout to be felt. What began as a mistake became a sanctuary, then a devotion, then a bond more unbreakable than anything the world could throw at them. Stay with me until the final word. Hit that like button and tell me your city in the comments. I want to see how far this connection reaches. Now let's begin. The sky over the city was a bruised purple, heavy with the kind of rain that feels like it's trying to wash away the sins of the street. Jessica Gates stood by the window of her dark apartment, the glow of her phone the only thing cutting through the gloom. Her hands were steady, but her heart was a different story. It was pounding a rhythm of pure, cold realization. Charles Robinson. 2 years of her life, 2 years of building a safe place, that turned out to be nothing but a well-constructed lie. She'd seen him downtown an hour ago, draped over someone else with the same easy smile he used to give her. She'd reached out once, then twice, radio silence. He wasn't just gone, he was pretending she never existed. But Jessica wasn't going to fade into the background. Do it, her friend Sarah urged over the speakerphone, her voice sharp with protective fire. Stop waiting for a man who's already moved on. Tell him exactly who he is. Let that be the last thing he ever gets from you. Jessica looked at the screen. She drafted the message until the words felt like iron. It wasn't a plea, it was a reckoning. My love, today marks the day my world stops. The worst feeling isn't being lonely, it's being forgotten by someone you could never forget. She closed her eyes, took a breath that tasted like iron and pressed send. The digital whoosh sounded like a gavel coming down. Done. She dropped the phone on the counter and reached for a glass of water, waiting for the surge of relief. Instead, her phone chimed almost instantly. Her stomach did a slow roll. That was too fast. Charles never replied that fast. She picked it up, her eyes narrowing as she read the unknown number at the top. The reply wasn't a defense. It wasn't an apology. It was poetry. Your words pierce the deepest corners of my soul. Loving with such fierce passion etches a mark that time itself can't fully erase. But darling, please never think you're forgotten. A heart as radiant and rare as yours is a treasure no one could ever truly let slip away forever. Jessica froze. Her breath hitched in the back of her throat. She scrolled down, her eyes widening as she hit the final line. You texted the wrong number. She stared at the screen until the words blurred. Somewhere across the city, in a room she couldn't imagine, a man named Kai Min-Jun had just looked into the darkest part of her heart, and instead of turning away, he had offered her a light. The game had changed, but the stakes were only just beginning to rise. The rain continued its relentless assault against the glass, a rhythmic drumming that mirrored the heavy thrum of Jessica's pulse. She stood in the center of her kitchen, the cold linoleum floor unheated as she stared at the screen of her phone. The message she had sent to Charles Robinson, the man she had loved for 2 grueling years, felt like a desperate anchor cast into a void. She had expected a wall of silence or perhaps a sharp, dismissive rebuttal. What she received instead was a symphony of words that felt like a hand reaching through the dark to steady her soul. Jessica read the reply again, her breath hitching as the glow of the screen illuminated the wet tracks on her cheeks. Loving with such fierce passion etches a mark that time itself can't fully erase. The words weren't the hollow excuses she had grown accustomed to from Charles. They were a profound acknowledgement of a heart he had never bothered to understand. For a fleeting, dizzying second, she allowed herself to believe that the betrayal she saw downtown had been a fever dream, that Charles had finally found the depth she always prayed stayed hidden beneath his shallow charm. Then the final line hit her like a physical blow. You texted the wrong number. The phone nearly slipped from her hand. Her heart did a frantic, erratic dance against her ribs. She frantically scrolled up, her eyes blurring as she compared the digits. One number. A single, insignificant digit had diverted her most intimate confession away from the man who broke her and into the hands of a complete stranger. The humiliation was a sudden, sharp heat in her chest. She had laid her spirit bare to a phantom. Her fingers moved with a frantic energy, typing out a hurried, shamed apology to the unknown recipient, begging him to ignore the intrusion. She hit send and dropped the device on the counter as if it had turned to live coal. But the silence that followed was short-lived. A chime signaled a new notification. It wasn't the ex-boyfriend she had tried to reach, nor was it a cold dismissal from the stranger. It was a simple, quiet question that cut through her defenses more effectively than any insult ever could. "Did you sleep?" Jessica stared at the 4 words. Charles had forgotten her name the moment it became inconvenient. But this man, this Kai Min-Jun, had heard the sound of a breaking heart through a digital error and chose to stay on the line. In the quiet of her stifling apartment, the radiator hissed like a warning, but Jessica found her thumb hovering over the keypad once more. The path back to her past was closed, but the road ahead had just been lit by a stranger's unexpected grace. The morning light offered no sanctuary, filtered through a gray haze that made the city look like a faded photograph. Jessica sat at her small dining table, the coffee in her mug turning cold as she stared at the digital scar on her screen. The urge to reach out to Charles one last time was a physical ache, a desperate need to demand why he had traded their 2 years for a fleeting Instagram story. Her thumb hovered over the keypad, ready to fire off a second, even more scathing message to the correct number, but her eyes kept drifting upward to the thread above it. She found herself rereading Kai Min-Jun's words for the 10th time that morning. "A heart as radiant and rare as yours is a treasure no one could ever truly let slip away forever." The sentiment was heavy with a sincerity she hadn't felt in years. Charles had always looked at her like a fixture in his life, convenient, reliable, but eventually invisible. He saw her as a destination he had already visited. But this stranger, this man who answered a wrong number in the dead of night, seemed to see the architecture of her soul. He recognized the fierce passion she carried, a depth that Charles had always stepped over as if it were a shallow puddle. The realization was a quiet thunder in her chest. A man who didn't know the sound of her laugh or the color of her eyes understood her worth better than the man who had slept beside her for 700 nights. She finally pulled up Charles's contact. The coward and liar text was still sitting there, unread, unacknowledged, a testament to his indifference. She began to type a new message, something to bridge the gap, but the words felt like ash. Every sentence she formed felt like she was begging for scraps from a table that had already been cleared. She switched back to the unknown number thread. Kai had asked if she slept. It was a simple, grounding inquiry that lacked the polished manipulation she was used to. It wasn't a demand for her time. It was an act of quiet observation. Jessica realized then that Charles didn't deserve her fire, and he certainly didn't deserve her grief. She deleted the draft to her ex and set the phone down. For the first time in months, the silence of the apartment didn't feel like a void. It felt like a space being held for someone who actually knew how to listen. She wouldn't chase a man who chose to forget her when a stranger was standing by, refusing to let her fade away. The transition from day to night became a bridge Jessica crossed with a newfound sense of anticipation. The sun would dip below the skyline, casting long amber shadows across her living room, and like clockwork, the soft chime of her phone would signal that the world had quieted enough for Kai Min-Jun to find her again. What began as a startling digital error had deepened into a nightly ritual, a sacred exchange of words that felt more substantial than any physical presence she had known in years. They existed in the blue light of their screens, two souls anchored in different hemispheres, yet tethered by a shared frequency of honesty. Jessica found herself peeling back the layers of her quiet loneliness, a burden she had carried so long it had begun to feel like a part of her skin. She confessed to him the weight of her deepest fear, not just the sting of being left but the terror of being forgotten. She told him how Charles had made her feel like a footnote in her own life, a name easily erased once the page was turned. She spoke of the hollow ache that comes when you realize you were merely a witness to someone else's journey, rather than a partner in it. On the other side of the world, Kai met her vulnerability with a gravity that felt like a shield. He didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, he shared the heavy, echoing silence of his own existence. He spoke of the widowed life he led, a world where the laughter of his daughter was the only color in a landscape of gray responsibility. He described the isolation of commanding a world where everyone looked at him with either fear or expectation, but never with understanding. He told her about the quiet of his home after the staff had retired, a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight, one he had carried alone until her accidental message broke the seal. "I have lived 1,000 nights where the only voice I heard was the one in my head," his message read, the text glowing against the dark of her room. Then you arrived, a radiant storm in the middle of my desert. You think you are easy to forget, Jessica, but you are the only thought that makes the silence bearable. Jessica leaned her head back against the couch, the radiator hissing a soft accompaniment to the thumping of her heart. She wasn't just a wrong number anymore. She was becoming the safest place Kai had ever known, and he was becoming the man who refused to let her disappear into the shadows. Their confessions were building a foundation that distance could not shake, a truth that was already more real than the life she was leaving behind. The intimacy of their digital sanctuary began to pull back its veil, revealing the cold, sharp edges of Kai's reality. As the days bled into weeks, the background of their connection shifted from quiet midnight musings to the hum of a life lived in constant motion and high-stakes precision. Jessica began to notice the subtle details in the fragments he shared. The unmistakable whine of jet engines in a brief voice note, the plush leather of a cabin that felt more like a command center than a vehicle, and the fleeting reflection of men with hard eyes standing guard in the polished metal of a car door. Kai's messages arrived at odd hours, often preceded by a heavy silence that suggested he was navigating a world where a single misstep could be fatal. He spoke of logistics and risk assessment, terms that sounded clinical until Jessica saw a photo of a sunset over a distant skyline, the corner of the frame catching the unmistakable barrel of a firearm resting on a velvet seat. It was a world of shadows and iron, a far cry from the marketing firm where Jessica spent her afternoons. Yet, despite the obvious danger he inhabited, his words to her remained a sanctuary of gentleness. "I am moving through a storm today," one message read, the text appearing as Jessica walked through the rain-slicked streets of her own neighborhood. "But your voice is the only thing that keeps the compass true." Jessica felt a thrill of apprehension that had nothing to do with the cold. She was catching glimpses of an empire built on secrets, a life where Kai Min-Jun was not just a grieving father, but a man who moved pieces on a global chessboard. She saw the way his daughter was never mentioned without a note of fierce, protective steel, as if the child were the only soft thing in a landscape of granite. One evening, a video call connected for only a few seconds, a mistake of the thumb on his end. Jessica saw him for a heartbeat sitting in the back of an armored sedan. He was dressed in a suit that looked like armor, his face a mask of absolute chilling authority as he spoke to someone off camera. Then his eyes found the screen, and the mask dissolved instantly into a look of such profound relief and tenderness that her breath caught. He ended the call before a word could be exchanged, but the image remained burned into her mind. She was falling for a man who lived in the heart of a fire, and she realized then that being loved by him meant being the one thing he would burn the world to protect. The digital bridge between their worlds took on a new, heart-wrenching dimension one evening when a voice note arrived that wasn't from Kai. Jessica pressed play, and instead of the low, measured authority she had come to rely on, she heard the sweet, high-pitched chatter of a child. It was a girl's voice, bright and full of the innocent wonder that only exists in a world where a father has built a fortress against the dark. The child spoke a few words in Korean, followed by a shy, practiced, "Hello, Jessica," in English, punctuated by a giggle that felt like a sunrise cutting through the gloom of Jessica's apartment. Then Kai's voice returned, but it was transformed. Gone was the stoic commander of shadows. In his place was a man whose every word was heavy with a desperate, all-consuming devotion. He explained that his daughter, Minna, had seen her photo and insisted on saying hello to the lady who makes Appa smile. Hearing him as a father stripped away the cold armor of his status, revealing a heart that was not just powerful, but profoundly human and aching with the responsibility of a singular love. The sound of that small voice deepened Jessica's emotional investment in a way Kai's most poetic messages never could. She realized that the world of danger Kai inhabited wasn't just about territory or iron. It was the high price he paid to keep that laughter echoing in his home. He wasn't just a man who moved pieces on a chessboard. He was a widower fighting to ensure his daughter never felt the sting of abandonment that Jessica knew all too well. As the recording ended, Jessica sat in the silence, her eyes burning. The mafia boss had been replaced by a man who cherished a radiant and rare heart because he was trying to raise one of his own. The fear she felt for his world began to merge with a fierce, protective need to be a part of the peace he was trying to build. She sent a voice note back, her own voice steady and warm, speaking to the child but looking for the man. For the first time, she wasn't just falling for a voice in the dark. She was falling for the family he was inviting her to protect. The stakes were no longer just about her heart. They were about a little girl's smile and the man who would burn the world to keep it. The silence of Jessica's evening was shattered not by the rhythmic chime of Kai's messages, but by a name that felt like a relic from a previous life. Charles Robinson's name flashed on her screen, accompanied by a string of texts that attempted to bridge the months of cold indifference with a sudden, desperate warmth. He spoke of regret, of seeing her at the market and feeling a pull he couldn't explain, and of wanting to return to the safest place they had once shared. As Jessica read his words, she waited for the familiar spike of adrenaline, the old ache of wanting to be chosen. But it never came. Instead, Charles's sentences felt thin and transparent, like a shallow stream bed parched by the sun. He used words like forever and always, as if they were cheap currency, lacking the weight of sacrifice or the gravity of true devotion. To Charles, love was a convenience to be reclaimed. To Kai, it was a treasure no one could ever truly let slip away. She looked at her phone, the contrast between the two men becoming a sharp, defining line in her soul. Charles begged for her attention, but Kai had already earned her respect. Kai's messages, often sent from the quiet of a private jet or the stillness of an armored car, described a love as boundless as the stars, unwavering, tender, and devoid of the shadow of abandonment. While Charles was trying to rewrite a story that had already ended, Kai was busy building a sanctuary where she would never have to wonder if she was forgotten. Charles's attempts to manipulate her nostalgia felt like an insult to the fierce passion Kai had recognized in her from the very first night. The man who had actually lived beside her had missed the architecture of her heart, while the stranger across the world had mapped it with a single misdirected text. Jessica realized that this safest place Charles offered was just a cage of old habits. She didn't bother to type a rebuttal. She didn't need to defend her new reality to a man who was still living in the old one. Jessica simply set the phone down and looked out at the city lights, waiting for the only voice that mattered. When the phone finally chimed, it wasn't a plea for a second chance. It was a simple, grounding note from Kai asking about her day. In that moment, the past didn't just feel distant. It felt irrelevant. The man who never promised loudly but showed up quietly had already won. The digital bridge that had sustained Jessica for months suddenly felt too narrow for the weight of the emotions crossing it. The late-night confessions and shared silences had become her lifeblood, but they existed in a vacuum of blue light and glass. That changed on a Tuesday evening when the radiator was quiet and the city outside was uncharacteristically still. The message from Kai was shorter than usual, but its gravity made the air in her apartment feel thick. "Choose a date," the text read. "I'll come." Jessica stared at those 3 words until they burned into her vision. The stakes had shifted in an instant. It was no longer a safe, distant exchange of souls across an ocean. It was a physical convergence. The man who moved through shadows and iron, the man whose voice was a sanctuary she had never actually touched, was asking to step into her light. The reality of his world, the armored cars, the silent men in suits, the life of absolute authority, was about to collide with the quiet marketing firm and the rain-slicked streets of her everyday existence. A wave of apprehension, cold and steady, washed over her. It wasn't fear of Kai, but fear of the truth. Up until now, she could imagine him as she needed him to be. But once he landed, the world of danger he never fully explained would become her world too. She thought of Minna's high-pitched giggle and Kai's description of a love without a single shadow of abandonment. To choose a date was to commit to that love, to step out from behind the screen and into the fire of his reality. She paced the length of her living room, her thumb hovering over the keypad. In her mind, she saw the airport terminal, the moment their eyes would meet, and the heavy choice she would have to make to leave the past entirely behind. Kai was a man who never promised loudly, but this was the ultimate quiet show of force. He was willing to cross the world to prove he wouldn't let her slip away. Jessica sat down, her hands steady as she looked at the calendar. The shadow of Charles Robinson was finally silenced by the thundering heart of a man who didn't just speak of boundless love, but acted on it. She typed a date 3 weeks away, a date that felt like a finish line for her old life and a starting gun for her new one. October 14th, she sent. "I'll be there," he replied. The weight of the decision settled over her, a mantle of beautiful responsibility. The words were over. The meeting was coming. And Jessica knew that once Kai Min-Jun arrived, the city would never look the same again. The days leading up to the meeting were marked by a tension that seemed to vibrate through the very air of Jessica's apartment. The digital connection that had been her solace suddenly turned brittle. Kai's messages grew shorter, stripped of their poetic warmth and replaced by the clipped, cold efficiency of a man at war. For 48 hours the screen remained dark, and the silence felt like a physical weight, a reminder that the man she loved presided over a world where peace was a hard-won commodity. When he finally reached out, the news was grim. A disruption in his territory, a move by a rival faction that viewed his impending absence as a window of opportunity, had placed his operations and his life in the crosshairs. The trip may not be possible, the message read, the text lacking its usual tenderness. I cannot leave a flank exposed. Jessica sat in the dim light of her living room, her heart sinking. The dream of the airport terminal, of finally touching the man who had mapped her soul, felt like it was dissolving into the gray mist of the city. But then an hour later the tone shifted. A new message arrived, accompanied by a photo that made her blood run cold. It was a shot of a sleek, black sedan parked on her very street, visible from her window. I have secured the perimeter, Kai wrote. You are not alone, Jessica. My men are there. They will remain until I arrive. If I am delayed, it is only because I am ensuring that when I step onto that plane, no shadow can follow me to you. The realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave. Being with Kai Min-Jun didn't just mean accepting his love. It meant living under his shield. The world of danger was no longer a distant abstraction. It was parked at her curb. She looked out the window and saw the silhouette of a man in the driver's seat, a silent sentinel sent from halfway across the globe to guard a woman he had never met. Jessica felt a strange, fierce mixture of terror and awe. Kai wasn't just a poet. He was a king protecting his treasure. He was burning his own world to the ground to make sure hers remained standing. She picked up her phone, her fingers steady despite the chaos of her thoughts. I'm not going anywhere, she sent. I'll be waiting at the gate. I know, he replied. Nothing in this world can keep me from you. The stakes were now absolute. The meeting was no longer just a romantic convergence. It was a victory over the darkness that tried to keep them apart. Jessica realized that she had crossed a line she could never uncross, trading a life of quiet loneliness for a life where she was the center of a man's entire empire. The morning of the 14th arrived with a sky the color of burnished steel, cold and heavy with the promise of a turning tide. Jessica moved through her apartment with a quiet, deliberate focus, each item placed in her suitcase acting as a seal on the life she was leaving behind. The radiator hissed its familiar, angry rhythm, but the sound no longer felt like a warning. It was a fading echo of a loneliness she had finally outgrown. She caught her reflection in the hallway mirror, seeing a woman whose eyes held a depth of resolve that had been forged in the blue light of midnight confessions. She was reaching for her coat when the heavy, insistent thud of a fist against her door shattered the stillness. Jessica froze. It wasn't the measured, professional knock of the men Kai had stationed downstairs. This was frantic, fueled by a desperate, selfish energy. She opened the door to find Charles Robinson standing in the hall. He looked disheveled, the easy charm that had once been his greatest weapon now replaced by a mask of sweating anxiety. Before she could speak, he was inside, the scent of expensive cologne and desperation filling the small foyer. Jessica, wait, he pleaded, his hands out as if trying to physically catch the air between them. I saw the car outside. I saw the men. I know you're planning to leave, but you're making a mistake. This isn't you. Whatever this is, it's a fantasy. Jessica stood her ground, her hand still resting on the handle of her suitcase. The only mistake I made, Charles, was believing that your silence was something I deserved. I was stupid, he countered, stepping closer, trying to find the old soft spots in her heart. I let things get away from me. But we have history. We have 2 years of a real life. You're going to throw that away for a man you've never even touched? A man who hides behind armored glass and soldiers. He reached for her arm, his fingers brushing the sleeve of her coat. Let me fix this. Let me rewrite the ending. We can go back to how it was. Jessica looked at him, and for a heartbeat she saw the man she had once thought was her safest place. But the image was thin, a hollow shell compared to the boundless love Kai had described. Charles was fighting to keep a possession. Kai was fighting to protect a treasure. You can't rewrite a story that has already ended, Charles. she said, her voice like a steady flame. You didn't just forget me. You chose to let me go. And in that silence, someone else heard me. She pulled her suitcase toward the door, walking past him without a second glance. The past was a weight she was no longer willing to carry. As she stepped into the hallway, leaving him standing in the middle of her empty apartment, Jessica realized that the countdown was over. The only thing waiting for her now was the truth. Charles followed her into the narrow hallway, his voice a relentless tide of familiar comfort and calculated fear. He didn't shout. Instead, he used the soft, intimate cadence that had once been Jessica's only sanctuary. He spoke of the coffee shop where they had met, the shared jokes that had built their world, and the predictable, quiet future he promised to restore. He played on the heavy, suffocating weight of the unknown, painting Kai as a fiction, a shadow man whose reality would eventually turn into a prison of iron and secrets. You don't know him, Jess, Charles murmured, his hand reaching out to catch the edge of her suitcase, forcing her to stop near the elevator. You know me. I'm the one who knows how you take your tea, the one who knows what you're afraid of. You're trading a real life for a man who sends soldiers to watch you. How long until those soldiers start watching you for him? How long until you realize you're just a secondary character in a war you don't understand? Jessica felt the old, familiar knot of doubt tighten in her chest. The fear of being forgotten was a powerful weapon, but the fear of stepping into a fire was even greater. Charles was offering a return to the shore, a chance to stay in the shallow water where she knew the depth. She looked at her watch. The minutes were slipping away, the countdown to the terminal's final call becoming a dull roar in her ears. For a heartbeat, the image of her apartment, of the radiator's hiss and the marketing firm's steady routine, felt like the only solid thing in the world. Charles saw the hesitation in her eyes and stepped closer, his expression one of feigned salvation. He was the devil she knew, the one who had once made her feel invisible but safe. But then her phone buzzed in her pocket, a sharp, grounding vibration. She didn't need to look at it to know it was Kai. She remembered his words. A heart as radiant and rare as yours is a treasure no one could ever truly let slip away. The contrast was a sudden, piercing light. Charles was using her history to keep her small. Kai was using his power to set her free. Charles saw her as a fixture to be reclaimed. Kai saw her as a light to be followed. I was never safe with you, Charles, she said, her voice cutting through his manipulation like a blade through silk. I was just hidden. She wrenched her suitcase from his grip and stepped into the elevator just as the doors began to slide shut. The ride down felt like an eternity, but as she burst through the lobby and into the waiting black sedan, the driver didn't ask questions. He simply pulled away from the curb with a roar of disciplined power. The past was shrinking in the rearview mirror, and though she was racing against a clock that didn't care about her heart, Jessica knew she was finally heading toward the only place where she was truly seen. The airport terminal was a vast, echoing cathedral of glass and steel, vibrating with the restless energy of 1,000 departures. Jessica moved through the crowd like a woman on a mission of survival, her suitcase trailing behind her with a determined rhythm. The air was thick with the scent of jet fuel and the low, constant hum of humanity, but her focus was fixed on the terminal gate. Behind her, the sound of hurried footsteps caught up, and she felt a hand clamp onto her shoulder. Charles was out of breath, his face a mask of wounded pride and desperate entitlement. Jess, stop, he commanded, his voice rising above the ambient noise of the terminal. People began to slow their pace, their eyes drifting toward the unfolding drama. You're throwing away 2 years for a shadow. Look at me. I am right here. I am real. You're going to board a plane to meet a man who is probably a monster, based on some words on a screen. Jessica stopped and turned slowly, her heart a steady drum of resolve. She didn't pull away, she simply stood her ground, the weight of his grip feeling like a shackle she had already broken in her mind. You keep talking about the 2 years, Charles, she said, her voice clear and resonant, carrying across the small circle of onlookers that had formed. But in those 2 years I was the one who was invisible. You stayed because it was easy. You left the moment it got hard. You weren't my safest place. You were just the man who taught me how to be alone while standing right next to you. Charles's face flushed as the public scrutiny began to weigh on him. I'm trying to save you. I've already been saved, Jessica replied, her gaze unwavering. By a man who heard me when I was screaming into a void. By a man who doesn't need to diminish me to feel powerful. She looked at his hand on her shoulder and then back at his eyes. The power dynamic that had once kept her small had evaporated. In its place was a fierce, cold clarity. She reached up and firmly removed his hand, her fingers steady and strong. "Don't follow me anymore, Charles. Your story ended the night you chose to forget me. Mine is just beginning." She turned her back on him, leaving him standing in the middle of the crowded terminal. A man finally reduced to the silence he had so often given her. She walked toward the security checkpoint, each step lighter than the last. She wasn't just walking toward a gate. She was walking away from a life that had tried to bury her. The past was a dead weight, and as she handed her boarding pass to the attendant, Jessica felt the final cord snap. The world of Kai Min-Jun was waiting, and she was finally ready to inhabit it. The descent into the city had been a blur of shifting clouds and the heavy, metallic hum of the aircraft, a transition that felt like shedding one skin for another. When Jessica stepped off the jet bridge and into the international arrivals terminal, the air was cooler, carrying a scent of sea salt and jet fuel that made her lungs feel alive. She moved with a strange, calm purpose, her suitcase wheels clicking against the polished marble as she scanned the sea of faces gathered behind the security barrier. She saw the men in suits before she saw him. They were impossible to miss. 6 tall, stoic figures positioned with military precision, their dark gazes moving with a clinical efficiency that cleared a path without a single word being spoken. They formed a silent human perimeter, an outpost of an empire she had only glimpsed through a screen. A chill of awe and apprehension raced down her spine. This was the world of danger Kai had managed to keep at a distance for so long, now standing in front of her in all its absolute, unwavering reality. Then the circle parted. Kai Min-Jun stood at the center of the formation, looking exactly as he had in the fleeting video call. A man of sharp angles and tailored iron. He wore a charcoal suit that fit like armor, his face a mask of practiced control. But it was the small hand gripped tightly in his that broke the tension. Minna stood beside him, dressed in a bright yellow coat that looked like a spark of sun in a gray world. Jessica's breath caught in the back of her throat. In all her midnight imaginings, she had wondered if the man would be different than the voice. But as Kai's eyes found hers across the crowded hall, the mask of authority didn't just fade, it dissolved. The intensity of his gaze was a physical weight, a look of such profound relief and recognition that the noise of the airport seemed to vanish. He didn't shout or wave. He simply stood there, his thumb tracing a comforting pattern over his daughter's knuckles, his presence a silent promise kept. Jessica didn't hesitate. She stepped past the last remnants of her past, moving toward the man who had heard her when she was invisible and the little girl who had called her a treasure. The distance between them, once measured in oceans and digital signals, was now down to a few final steps. The world of danger was all around them, but as she looked into Kai's eyes, Jessica realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't just safe, she was found. The transition was complete. She wasn't just a woman at a gate, she was home. The walk from the arrival gate to the waiting motorcade was a revelation of a world Jessica had only sensed through the static of a phone line. As she moved alongside Kai, the atmosphere in the terminal seemed to thicken with a heavy, unspoken gravity. This was not the casual gait of a man returning home. It was the progression of a sovereign. Travelers instinctively veered out of their path, and airport staff offered deep, hurried bows that spoke of a deep-seated, institutionalized respect. The 6 men in suits moved with a disciplined lethality, their eyes scanning the balconies and corridors with a focus that made the air feel electrified. The physical reality of Kai's power hit Jessica with the force of a gale. He was not merely the lonely widower who wrote poetry in the dead of night. He was a man who commanded the very ground they walked on. She saw the way a group of businessmen in the terminal stopped mid-sentence as Kai passed, their faces pale with a recognition that looked remarkably like dread. He was a man people feared, a figure whose name likely carried the weight of life and death in the boardrooms and back alleys of this city. For a moment, the vastness of the gap between them felt insurmountable. She was a woman from a world of marketing deadlines and radiator hisses, now standing in the center of an empire built on iron and silence. She looked at Kai, expecting to see that cold mask of authority turned toward her, but what she found was the ultimate subversion of his strength. Kai stopped beside the sleek, armored sedan and turned to her. In the midst of the bustling terminal, surrounded by his soldiers and the heavy scent of jet fuel, He reached out and gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was so light, so achingly careful that it felt like a benediction. The hard, clinical steel in his eyes vanished, replaced by an unwavering tenderness that seemed to pull her into a private sanctuary where his power could not reach. "You are here," he whispered, his voice a low, steady anchor in the chaos. "The world is loud, Jessica, but you are the only thing I hear." In that look she understood the truth of Kai Min-Jun. To the rest of the world he was a storm to be avoided, a man of dangerous consequence. But to her he was the man who had heard her heart when it was a whisper in the dark. He wasn't just a poet or a boss. He was a man who used his entire empire as a wall to keep her safe. As he opened the car door, inviting her into the velvet silence of his reality, Jessica realized she wasn't just entering a new life. She was becoming the heartbeat of the man who ruled it. The terminal floor seemed to stretch into infinity, a sea of strangers and shifting light. But Jessica's world had narrowed to the two souls standing at the center of the storm. She did not look back. Behind her, the air was still thick with the desperate, hollow echoes of Charles Robinson, a man who had spent years trying to keep her small enough to fit into the corners of his life. He was a memory already fading, a shadow eclipsed by the absolute, sun-bright reality of the man waiting ahead. Jessica walked past the final barrier, her gait steady and rhythmic against the marble. As she reached the perimeter of Kai's security, the men in suits stepped aside with a disciplined, silent respect that felt like the opening of a temple gate. She stopped inches from Kai, the scent of the city and expensive wool clinging to him, but it was his eyes that anchored her. They were dark, deep, and filled with a relief so profound it looked like pain. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers with a strength that felt like a permanent seal. It was a heavy, grounded connection, the kind that promised to hold even when the world began to tear at the edges. Beside him, Minna looked up, her bright yellow coat a splash of defiance against the gray terminal, and offered a shy, knowing smile that told Jessica she was no longer a stranger to this family. "You chose a date," Kai said, his voice a low, resonant hum that cut through the noise of the airport. "And I chose you." They turned together, walking toward the exit where the armored motorcade waited under the bruised purple sky. Jessica knew that by stepping into that car she was leaving the safety of her quiet, predictable marketing life for a world where the stakes were measured in survival and iron. She was entering a life that would be messy, complicated, and often dangerous. A life lived in the high-contrast shadows of Kai Min-Jun's empire. But as the door of the sedan closed, sealing out the rest of the world in a velvet silence, she realized that the mistake of a single digit had been the only honest thing to ever happen to her. She wasn't just a woman who had been found. She was a woman who had finally found something worth the fight. The past was a closed book, and as Kai's hand tightened over hers in the dim light of the moving car, the story didn't end. It simply became real. It was a love that was eternal, true, and finally undeniably hers.